In front of me this morning I have a submission called Submission in Relation to the 21st and 22nd Periodic Review of the New Zealand under the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. This was created, produced, written July 2017 by Susan Devoy. In there are some very interesting lines. To talk us through what you need to know is political commentator Lindsay Perigo, who's written about this. Good morning, Lindsay, and thanks for your time this morning.
Good morning, and congratulations for raising this matter, because it is of the gravest urgency, and my fear is people don't realise the seriousness of the threat to free speech that this country faces.
You've written about this in recent months, weeks in fact. What is it about this particular report that Susan Devoy has actually authored that concerns you the most?
Just the parts that you've read out, but you see, that came about because the Human Wrongs Commissariat, as I prefer to call it, was knocked back in its previous attempt to enforce more strictly the existing provisions against hurting people's feelings. Now, we already have laws on the book in the Human Rights Act that could result in, you can go to jail for 3 months if you hurt someone's feelings. That's not exactly what the legislation says, but that's what it's tantamount to. Now, they invoked that in a case they took to the High Court in the case of those Al Nisbet cartoons that one of your earlier callers brought up. But they were knocked back by the High Court. The High Court found against the Human Wrongs Commissariat and in favour of Mr. Nisbet's right to pen cartoons such as that. Although at the same time, the High Court said that we should all be conscious of the effect our statements have on other people. And at that point, I wrote a separate article, separate from the one that you're quoting this morning, saying this is enough. The chilling effect of that is enough. There'll be no more Al Nisbet cartoons. There'll be no more Bob Jones saying that there should be a special Waitangi Day for Pākehā where they get served breakfast in bed by Māori and that sort of thing. All of that will end without another law being passed, simply because the High Court has said, oh, you've got to be conscious of the effect of your statements on other people's feelings. But that technically it was a setback for the Commissariat because the High Court, in its findings, did not uphold the Commissariat's application. And so Devoy, and I'm aware of this from a personal conversation I had with her before the Nisbet case went to court, she said to me, this was at Auckland University, we were both speaking at an event, that there was a free speech case coming up that they were pinning their hopes on. So their hopes were dashed. So now they want to take it a little bit further. As you quoted from that submission she presented to her puppet masters at the United Nations last year, and you're quite right, they are being utterly disingenuous when they say there is no such provision. Well, there isn't at the moment, but that's what they want. That's what she was wanting, and that's why I'm rather glad that she's gone. But I'm also very fearful that whoever they put in her place will be as bad, if not worse.
Lindsay, one of the recommendations she's made in this report, and it says the committee urges the government to review the adequacy of the current structures and processes to respond appropriately to New Zealand's changing demographics. Nothing wrong with that in principle when you just read it as that. But then when you go down further, it talks about, and she makes the provisions are therefore unable to be utilised in respect of religious hate speech directed at Muslim New Zealanders who for the most part belong to a variety of ethnic minority communities in New Zealand. What do you make of that? To me, that sounds like that for hundreds of years in this country, many people have subscribed to Christianity, no problems there. But all of a sudden, when we draw or we criticise Islam, for example, all of a sudden, to me, that's saying that Islam will be off limits to any critique. And I wonder what your views are of that.
And that's exactly the object of it. That's the purpose. It's preferential treatment for Muslims. It's protecting Muslims from having their feelings hurt. And the Muslims will say their feelings are hurt when you say anything critical of their religion. or even draw their prophet, because you're not allowed to depict him visually. So it takes nothing at all to offend a Muslim, and we'll end up in a situation where people are jailed for having an opinion. Now, all that is necessary to fix this is to uphold what we already have in law, which is Article 14 of our Bill of Rights. If I can bring it up here, I'll read it out to you. But you see, unfortunately, the Bill of Rights also contains a provision that says anything in this bill can be negated by anything else in any other bill. And the Article 14 upholds our right to basically express any opinion at all. Here it is. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression, including the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and opinions of any kind in any form. That's Article 14 of our Bill of Rights, Chris, and it's absolutely perfect. That's all we need. So we've got to remove the part of the Bill of Rights that says anything in this bill can be negated by anything else in any other piece of legislation. And I've also suggested, if you read a little bit further down, that we should have Salman Rushdie's famous dictum, "There's no such thing as a right not to be offended," emblazoned across the sky. Along with Voltaire's, "I disagree with what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it." Now, that is the spirit that I think has guided us in our civil discourse, and often uncivil discourse, over the period of decades, a century and a bit. And it should continue to be that way. But what we have now, it's not just Islam, but it is primarily Islam. But this notion has taken hold. I'm afraid your generation are particularly culpable. Chris, the snowflake generation, who need their safe zones and all the rest of it, that any vigorous expression of opinion is deemed to be offensive and desirably illegal.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you about, Lindsay. I wonder whether you believe the likes of the Human Rights Commission and the Susan Devoys of this world have been influenced too much by Generation Outrage. And Generation Outrage wants to be seen to be outraged because it gives them a sense of identity, Lindsay. Everybody wants to be noticed, and to be noticed is to be outraged, and to be outraged is to be noticed.
Well, you put it perfectly. I'm assuming that you've noticed this among your peers. Now,
Yes, I have.
Generally referred to as millennials. I call them moronials for exactly that reason that you talk about. Their sole purpose of getting out of bed, and they wouldn't be able to find any other one, is to find something to be offended by. And it's just utterly tiresome and infantile. And yes, I don't doubt that the Human Wrongs Commissariat has been influenced by that to some extent. This mentality is extremely prevalent at the United Nations, and Devoy, in part, is seeking to appease the United Nations with what she's doing here, but she believes it herself. I was really dismayed on this occasion that I've mentioned when I spoke with her and how utterly dour and humorless she had become. This was not the Susan Devoy squash champion that I remembered from many years earlier. And she even said of a particular statement, I've forgotten what the statement was, but she said, "Oh, that's very stale, male, and white." That's Susan Devoy. Is that hate speech, I wonder?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you're allowed to say stale, pale, and white, and that's deemed to be fine now. But if you were to turn the tables and call, something else like black or something, heaven forbid, you'll be on Generation Outrage's radar. Now, we had a Maori academic on this program. I was away when this interview took place, I think from Canterbury University. Now, she was expressing concerns about this too, from a Maori perspective, saying that it was kind of wrong that, well, if we're going to be looking at protecting minorities, that all of a sudden Maori weren't even mentioned in some of this. What's your understanding of what that was about, Lindsay?
Well, I'm not familiar with that, but she's quite right that the thing can backfire. It can redound to the disadvantage of the people who are propagating it. I repair to something that you said yourself a little bit earlier in the program, that if you're confident in your opinions, in your cause, then you ought not to fear criticism, debate, scrutiny. And having the thing aired in the public marketplace. That's always the way we've dealt with matters of contention, including anything to do with race, and that should continue to be the case. And at times it will get brutal. I don't mean violent, I mean brutal. People will say things that upset other people. People will say things that are thoughtless, insensitive, and all the rest of it. That's a part of freedom of speech. Grow the heck up. That's what you want to say to your generation outrage.
Generation outrage, though, for better or worse, does have power, though, don't they, Lindsay? And I think of various cases, across the globe, really, where if there's a particular media organisation or a program that is deemed to be offensive, now campaigns have been started to get advertisers to pull out of programs. And at the end of the day, the networks across the globe are all about money. There was even, I think, one case here in New Zealand, rightly or wrongly, where there was a push to get rid of somebody, and they went to all the advertisers. Is that their right to do so? It is, though, isn't it?
It is their right. That's part of free speech. You can say, hey, I find that so objectionable that I think we should boycott this person's business or product. There's a perfect right to do that. And indeed, that's the ideal way. If you're sufficiently upset and you genuinely think that something is that objectionable, then get together with like-minded people and make sure that there's some kind of informal boycott or formal. But what really dismays me is that without such things happening, businesses cave. You've got the silly nonsense with Starbucks in the United States at the moment. And they're now allowing their premises to be used by people who are not buying coffee or buying anything at all, and they're even allowed to use the toilets, but they're allowed just to have their business meetings at Starbucks. And this is purely on the basis of what they thought would be pressure from people in the name of anti-racism. That really is silly. But your point is well taken. If you object to something, then make your point of view known, and if you object to it sufficiently strongly, get together with like-minded people and make a really big noise about it. But that's as far as it should go. Banning the expression of opinions, jailing people for having an opinion, that's absolutely a no-no as far as I'm concerned. And I do think, as I've said at the end of that article, I hope you get to quote that bit at some stage, we should have an international coalition for free speech, because this nonsense is going on all over the world, and it needs to be resisted all over the world.
Just finally, Lindsay, had a couple of text messages in this morning saying we don't care about this. And I thought I'd give you the last say. In your view, people listening to this program this morning, Lindsay, why should we care?
Well, you shouldn't if you don't care about freedom of speech. But if you don't care about freedom of speech, I would advise you to go and live somewhere where there is no freedom of speech. Go to Iran or North Korea or Zimbabwe or Cuba, and you'll find things much more congenial in those countries than here, where we do still largely have freedom of speech, although it's under very serious threat. I hold people who don't care about this in utmost contempt, and if that hurts their feelings, good.
Lindsay Perigo, political commentator, great to have you on our program this morning. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Chris, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, sir.